that we're going to start with is what's the difference between parody and pastiche? Because those two lit devices, as you're annotating your novels, are really, really similar. Okay? So I'm going to ask you first, before I start verifying these ideas, what is parody? Awesome. A parody, and make sure you have this down somewhere, is when you copy something in order to comment on it. It's when you mimic something to comment on it. Okay, so this is mimic to comment. And so, yeah, Caleb said Will Ferrell, and that's essentially what Saturday Night Live does, especially around election season, is we've got a series of actors who are mimicking Sarah Palin or mimicking Obama or mimicking George W. in order to make comments about them, in order to criticize them. Okay, so if parody is mimicking to comment or critique, what's pastiche?
Is that just to mimic it?
Say Po?
Just to mimic it.
Awesome. Pastiche is, you do mimic, but the point of the mimic is not commentary. You're just mimicking to mimic. This, in a sense, is more of a postmodern tenet. Yeah, like Family Guy. That's a phenomenal example. Family Guy mimics something just to mimic it. Like flashed a scene of Pinocchio. And it's super vulgar and they're mimicking Pinocchio, but they're not commenting on the story of Pinocchio. They're just mimicking it. Or cut to Toucan Sam, or cut to the Cocoa Puffs bird. Whatever type of bird that, what is the Cocoa Puffs bird? It's a what? I can't say that on camera.
Welcome back. So, our last take on the Dome of the Rock is titled The Great Pastiche of Islam. Were the Dome of the Rock mosaics and inscriptions just intended as a mere pastiche? Heard this from a friend the other day. I used to watch Judge Judy, but I don't remember her saying this, but apparently this is a common phrase that she says. If it doesn't make sense, it's usually not true. And that's her general principle when she's trying to detect if someone who is speaking to her in a case is basically talking baloney or if they're being truthful. So there's a kind of a logic to that. If things don't add up, it's usually because there's some form of falsehood, deceit, lie, call it what you may. I think that's a good principle. Sometimes in looking at the origins of Islam, we bend over backwards, we do mental gymnastics, and we're all guilty of this, to try and make things fit. And I never thought, getting into this, that there would be so much of that. And we tried to make sense of it, we tried to make it fit. An obvious example would be with the chronology in relation to Muhammad, all the conflicting points of data that didn't make any sense in terms of when he reigned, when he died, and you name it, where he lived. None of it added up. And then we could talk about the Quran, we could talk about Mecca, the multiple other aspects of the grand narrative. But the fact that it doesn't make sense, I would kind of be very sympathetic to Judge Judy's point. It's usually not true. Okay, there's sometimes extenuating circumstances where, sometimes life is weirder than fiction. That can happen. But usually things make sense. Things shouldn't be so twisted that we need to do backflips, mental gymnastics, in order to make things fit. So why so late? We saw that 9 centuries passed before the first reference is made to inscriptions. That's a lot of time. It was also as late as the 19th century before an archaeologist first noted the correction of the inscription to Al-Mamun. Again, why so late? Why did it take until then? Now, we know from A.J. Juice, he asserts that actually the Al-Mamun correction happened in the really early part of the 19th century, which makes perfect sense now if we have an archaeologist that discovers it for the first time. But obviously the correction had only been done a short time before that. So, that says it all, really. The simple reason why it was so late is because it didn't exist until then. We need to do mental gymnastics to otherwise account for why a remarkable inscription was not remarked upon. That doesn't make sense. Why would a 20-meter long inscription of huge importance, of great interest, and yet wasn't mentioned for 9 centuries, not even remarked upon, not even referenced, nothing for 9 centuries. And as soon as we believe it did show its face, as it were, suddenly there's a whole plethora of references, no problem. Hundreds and hundreds of articles and references to in books and so on over the last few centuries once it came into the public arena. But before that, nothing. That should say it all. When it is revealed, it has a combination of Mamluk rosettes. Now, if you know anything about the Mamluks, they didn't exist in the 7th century, so those features in the mosaics are from centuries after, even if we kind of push it back to the earliest, we're talking, a few centuries after the 7th century, which doesn't mean that they were made at that time even. They could have been simply mimicked at a later time. So, when it is revealed, it has a combination of Mamluk rosettes, Ottoman-style mosaics, which obviously come from 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, and the early Kufic script. Now that in itself would not be difficult to mimic if a person so wished. I'm sure if we want to mimic the Egyptian script from the time of the pharaohs, I'm sure we could quite easily create one of those if we wanted. Once you make one, it's pretty difficult to determine when the thing was made. The styles come from different eras, yet it all holds together as if done as part of the one project. Yeah, it all glues together nicely, all of these different styles. That doesn't happen organically over centuries. If you put features on a wall and then add other features later, it's going to be very difficult to make it fit. It's going to stick out from each other. The materials that you use are going to be slightly different. The colours will look slightly different. It'll be very difficult to replicate it. It's far more logical that all of these things came at roughly the same time as part of the one project. So, you see here, I'm going to be talking about a pastiche. And why am I referencing a pastiche? Well, I've had some interesting discussions from Thomas Alexander, and I've not really had a full chance to respond to his comments. They're valid comments. He basically would say that, well, this all sounds like a vast conspiracy theory. While that is one possibility, it's probably the least likely explanation. So I don't think we need to turn to conspiracy theory to explain this, which is why I think we need to talk about pastiches. And there is an innocent explanation for these inscriptions, these mosaics on the wall. We don't have to assume that they are done with the intention to deceive. So what do I mean by pastiche? So the definition of pastiche is an artistic work in a style that imitates that of another work, artist, or period. So doing that, it's very commonplace. It isn't necessarily deceptive, particularly given the context. You know, if you were to basically cover up a building for a couple of decades, for example, and then you were to reveal a classical building underneath, well, given the context that people would have seen the curtains over the building and the work being done on it, people could be hardly accused of deceiving the public by producing a classical building. And if someone did say, you know, oh, you're trying to deceive us, well, the people say, well, isn't it not obvious that this has just been built? We've been working on it. We're not, you know, we're just doing a classical building. We're doing a neoclassical building is what we would typically say today. So there's no question of it being a deceit or a lie or anything like that. It's just simply in the context, it's obvious. And so therefore there was no comment necessary in a situation like that. So modern example of a pastiche is a mock Tudor home, okay, which would look something like this. Now it's basically a false facade on the building. It's a regular building, but people like this style on the outside. But the actual building style is not what was used, as you found in Tudor times. It's just basically a fake front. Now, you'd never accuse someone who builds a home like that of trying to deceive the public into thinking that they had a real 15th or 16th century Tudor home, would you? It's pretty obvious what it is. It's just meant to be a pastiche. It's a nod to former times, and that's all it is. I think what we're dealing with inside in the Dome of the Rock, and this is where I differ with Thomas Alexander, who have the height of respect for, and I value his work. So it's kind of uncomfortable for me to suggest that these inscriptions are actually much later, as A.J. Juice would say. But what I would suggest is that the inscriptions and the mosaics that were done in the 16th century were just simply a pastiche. They were a nod to former times. They were an attempt to give credit to the first builders of the dome. Unfortunately, they didn't know exactly who it was, and there was an internal debate about it, and they tried their best to put the correct person there, and they changed their mind, actually, as we saw 3 times. But nonetheless, that was it. There was no obvious attempt to deceive people by suggesting that the inscription actually came from the 7th century. All it says in the inscription is that the dome was originally built by Abd al-Malik, or al-Mamun in the correction, but it doesn't actually say specifically that the inscription itself was made in the 7th century. And I would hazard a guess, considering the amount of construction work that had been done in the centuries up to the 16th century, the context would have been pretty obvious that this wasn't an original. The locals would have had that local memory, and they wouldn't dare suggest that, because I think it would have been too obvious to everyone, and they would have been laughed out of Jerusalem. So I don't think there was a real intention to deceive. I suppose the only attempt to deceive maybe would have come in the 20th century, and maybe a part of this might have been ignorance, superstition, and lack of historical memory of what actually happened in the 16th century. And that's excusable to some extent, because things can get lost in the mix, and they wouldn't necessarily have a written letter from the 16th century explaining what went on in the work, because a lot of these things were left unexplained. You know, the artists, the artisans died, bringing with them their thoughts and memories and secrets and all the rest of it. And that's, I think, what's happened here. It's there is a more innocent explanation, I would suggest, even though there is obviously a possibility of a conspiracy, but I don't think it's necessarily true or necessarily needed to explain or account for what happened. So, it is possible that there is a simple explanation for the Dome of the Rock's mosaics and inscriptions, that they were meant merely as a commemoration of the 9 centuries since Umar first built on the site. When they were first unveiled in the 16th century, no explanation was deemed necessary, as it was pretty obvious to Muslims that the work was new, and they had all seen what it was like beforehand. In this scenario, there was no attempt to commit a fraud or to mislead the public. It was only in later times that people started to believe it was more archaic than it actually was. The pastiche was too convincing. However, it wasn't perfect, as we'll see later. Many revisions, but all historically incorrect. The first inscription, in 1543 AD, the claim that Umar built the dome was probably felt to be too bold a claim, and it was later replaced in 1744 to Abd al-Malik. However, they still weren't happy. This isn't in itself evidence of a fraud or a conspiracy, but could reflect an internal debate as to who ought to be given credit for the original dome. We normally don't accuse someone of deceit who corrects mistakes. If they perceived that there was a mistake done in terms of claiming that Umar built the dome, when in fact it was Abd al-Malik, and they were to correct it, I don't think it would be fair to claim that it was necessarily a deceit. I would say it was actually an honest attempt to revise a mistake. So obviously, looking at the best possible take on this is called the steel man argument rather than the straw man argument. So we're trying to give the best possible defense for why this might have happened, rather than just merely see the worst possible explanation. However, even though they finally settled on Al-Mamun, changing it in the 19th century, this again was incorrect, as the first dome built on the site was not built until at least 40 years after the time of Caliph Al-Mamun. A.J. Juice gives evidence for that with a witness account in 897. That would have been about 27 years after the monk goes on the Temple Mount in 870. And in that 897 witness account, as we saw, it talks about Abd al-Malik building the Dome of the Rock. But the problem is the monk doesn't see it when he reports about the Temple of Solomon on the Temple Mount, but in the wrong location, so therefore it cannot be the Dome of the Rock. A commemorative inscription misunderstood. The dome was built by a servant of God, Abd Allah, the Imam al-Mamun commander. The bit in square brackets is viewed as the insertion, so Abd al-Malik is expected to have been there prior to that insertion. So let me read it again. Abdul Allah, the Imam al-Mamun, commander of the faithful, in the year 270, may God accept from him and be content with him. Amen, Lord of the worlds, praise be to God. And you can find the translation there given on the Islamic Awareness website. The problem here is that, is this typical of the way inscriptions were done? It doesn't tell us when the inscription was done. It doesn't say who wrote the inscription. And is that typical of the way inscriptions were done in the 7th century? If this is meant to be the 7th century that this was done in, the first thing is, why doesn't it say that this inscription was done in that year? It doesn't. We shouldn't just automatically assume that the inscription was made in the year that it claims that the building was built. It doesn't say that. So we have to be careful of reading into the inscription something it doesn't say. Nowhere does it say the inscription was created in the year 270. It is merely proclaiming to the public when it is believed the first building was built on the site. Inscription does not follow the pattern we find in verified inscriptions from the 7th century. In the 7th century, the inscriptions were typically not anonymous. Here's an example. This is the dam belonging to the servant of God Muawiyah, commander of the faithful. Abdallah bin Saksir built it with God's permission in the year 58. Allah forgive the servant of God Muawiyah, commander of the faithful, confirm him in his position and help him. Amir bin Habab wrote it. So we have a clear indication of who wrote it at the very least there. Okay, so it wasn't anonymous usually. We get an indication of who was responsible for the inscriptions. Usually they contain a reference to who ordered the inscription to be made. Here's an example. This is a composite from 4 damaged milestones from the 690s. I've mentioned those before on earlier videos. Servant of God Abdul al-Malik, commander of the faithful, God's love be upon him, ordered this road, or to straighten it presumably, and to make the milestones from Damascus up to this mile. So you can see a clear reference to the fact that he ordered the making of the inscription. The milestones effectively are the inscriptions. Okay. Here's another example. The servant of God, Abdul al-Malik, commander of the faithful, ordered the straightening of this mountain road. It was made by Yahya bin Al in Muharrem of the year 370 or 80, because the last bit was cut off. So here again, it was made by Yahya. Okay. Now, doubt it Yahya built the mountain road, even though he might have been a strong fella. Presumably it means the inscription or the sign that was put up was made by Yahya. So that's typical what happened. And I think the fact that we have usually the person who ordered it to be done is mentioned, the person who wrote the inscription is mentioned, and obviously then that would link the inscription to the time that the building was made. So you have 3 points there that you can confirm that the inscription is from the time. Okay, so we have the Abdul al-Malik ordering it, you have the name of the person who wrote the inscription, you've got the date in which the building was made, and so therefore you can deduce that the inscription was done at that time. You know, logically it's linked, whereas in the case of the Dome of the Rock we don't have the 3 points there. All we have is the fact that it mentions anonymously that Abdul al-Malik built a Dome of the Rock in a certain year. There is no reference to him ordering this inscription to be made. There is no reference to who made the inscription. So without that data point, it's a false conclusion to assume that the inscription came from that time. It's not sufficient to make that conclusion. Now, aside from that, we also have a contradiction of its claim as to when Abdul al-Malik built a building. Now, this will be familiar to many of you. You'll have seen this before. This is an inscription that was on a rock near Taif, and it says this was written in the year the Masjid al-Haram was built, in the 78th year, which would be 698. Okay, now We don't know if this is authentic or genuine. We can assume it is. But either way, it doesn't really bode well. Notice it specifies that the inscription was written in the same year as the Masjid al-Haram was built, unlike the Dome of the Rock that doesn't. So, in terms of which inscription would I more likely to believe to be from the time, I would believe this one over the Dome of the Rock every time, because it fits the pattern from the time. Okay? So, it's telling us exactly when it was written. It's telling us it was written at the same time as the Masjid al-Haram. That's the pattern. Now, I haven't got the full inscription here. It would be interesting if we were to go into the wider inscription to figure out, does it mention who did the inscription or not? But typically, if you were to look at tens of thousands of the inscriptions that are all over Arabia, you'll find that I would say 9 times out of 10, if not higher odds than that, the person who inscribes the inscription is usually mentioned. Okay, so I think the key thing, you need at least one of two things in terms of the inscription. You need, and this would have been typical of the 7th century, you need ideally the year that the inscription was done, and the person who made it was also mentioned. Okay, that would be typical. Occasionally one or other is left out, but it wouldn't be typical. But the Dome of the Rock is leaving both of those out, which, if I were intentionally trying to create a fraud in the Dome of the Rock, okay, at the very least I would have been aware that was the pattern from the 7th century. That to leave that out would have been obvious to anyone with any familiarity with the rock inscriptions. Okay, so I don't think it was intentional fraud on that basis. I think it was never intended to be meant to be taken as from the 7th century. I think that's a fair way of assessing it. That's why I would kind of step away from AJ Juice's claim that it's fraud in this case with the inscription. I think it probably wasn't, because I think a fraudster would have made a better attempt at it, and they would have at least made it more consistent. Now, they did get the writing style. They mimicked the writing style pretty well, the Kufic script, even though there's flaws with that, which we'll see, which might have been part of, there's an intention behind that. So I think we can give a reasonable explanation for why there's a anomaly there. But I don't think I think it was just an intention to commemorate an earlier time and to mimic that style in a pastiche sort of way, but it was never intended to give the impression that the inscription was from the 7th century in reference to the Dome of the Rock. Now, the other thing I would say is, if one or both inscriptions are bogus, then the discrepancy is resolved. So in other words, if this here is bogus, or the Dome of the Rock is bogus just mean that it's not actually from the time, okay? So one or the other, or both. If they're bogus, then there's no longer obviously a discrepancy. It's still the case that I would say that the Dome of the Rock inscription is from a later time, and there's an innocent explanation. If we say this is true, then that's more evidence for why the inscription in the Dome of the Rock is not from the time. Okay. In doing a pastiche of the early Kufic script, it went a little too far to be convincing. We're expected to believe that the orthography for the inner and outer arcades have a completely different orthography, yet these were produced at the time of the building of the Dome of the Rock. This is how we are said to take it or interpret it by many people who believe that the inscriptions are from the 7th century. Now, Crystal Kessler has stated that all critical signs, with the exception of 3, are found on the inner face of the arcade only. Okay, now, I would say that if we just think this through, there's 2 possibilities that we can dismiss. One is if this had been done at the time of Abd al-Malik. Well, if they had started on the inscriptions and followed one type of orthography in terms of how many diacritical marks they put on the writing, and then at a later time, still during the time of Abd al-Malik, they went to another form which had a lot more diacritical signs to make it much clearer, I can't imagine that the imperfection of the inconsistency between both sides would have been just left. They would surely have been harmonized and not left sort of hanging. Pardon the pun. So that's me dismissing one possibility. The other possibility is that this was meant to be a fraud. Okay, so the conspiracy theory option. Well, what conspiracy fraudster would knowingly make the inner and outer arcades different in such a dramatic way? It would have been it would be like trying to print fake money and leaving out some of the key emblems on it. It was that obvious, you know. So I don't think it was meant to be a fraud. It wasn't meant to be that. So the third option is just it was a pastiche. It was trying to convey the periods of time that the Dome of the Rock has gone through. The outer arcade represents the more ancient period of time. The inner one is where there's the majority of the diacritical represents a more recent era. And so that's a totally different take. Now, if you think, oh, well, the artists were not really that conscious of symbolism and so on. And I would respond to that by saying, are you not aware of all the symbolism on the motifs right across the face of the arcades? It's obviously well thought out. The artists, the artisans knew what they were doing, and they had consciously thought about all the meanings of the different shapes and signs and so on. This was not just randomly put together. So I think this fits in with the idea of it being a pastiche. It was never meant to be taken that way, and it's pretty obvious. In fact, I would say the artisans made it intentionally obvious that this was meant as a pastiche and not as a nearly 7th century work. Okay. Now, so this is from the inner face. Okay, this is from that paper. This is from the outer face. Okay. So essentially, it appears to be studied ambiguity, almost complete absence of diacritical marks on the outer side of the arcade, and on the inner side we have the majority of the diacritical marks are present. Again, if it doesn't make sense, it's usually not true. So it doesn't make sense to suggest that this was either from the 7th century. Abd al-Malik or his successor would have sorted these out to make them consistent. They wouldn't have been just left like that. And on the other side of it, a fraudster wouldn't be so blatant and obvious in their mistakes here. They would have kept it consistent, unless they are trying to suggest some form of evolution, which is a bit of a stretch. I don't know. It's I don't buy the conspiracy line. So I think the other option is that it was a pastiche holds true. Now there's also the fact that the artisans made quite a mistake in trying to make a pastiche of the 7th century, in that the orthography of kaf is not consistent with the 7th century, but is more like the 9th century, whether they were aware of that or not. So I'm going to read here from Crystal Kessler's work. She says, "To this issue, the inscription in the Dome of the Rock makes a valuable contribution. It has the kaf clearly marked by one stroke below 5 times. When one looks for other specimens with this type of marking, one finds that the discussion is mainly based on 3rd century documents. A Mushaf fragment, which was later in the possession of a Seljuk Sultan of Rum, a codex of rare words in tradition, a fragment of a translation of the Book of Job, an Arabic New Testament lectionary, and 2 papyri. The only 1st century example which was used in the discussion can no longer be verified. It is the badly written graffito in the Jordanian desert castle Karana, of which only the last lines with the date 92 can be read properly." Okay, so essentially what she's saying is that there are no examples of this type of orthography from the 7th century. Our earliest examples of it are from the 9th century, which means that this is anachronistic in the Dome of the Rock. It's wrong. It's part of the pastiche, I would say, and it's easier to explain that this was a mistake done in the 16th century, where they didn't have a clear idea of what the Kufic script was like in the 7th century, and they used what examples of the early Kufic script were like. Unfortunately, they used ones where it was only used in the 3rd century onwards, and so therefore they got it wrong. Most of it was pretty on the ball, but this was one of the mistakes that they made. Now she goes on to say that B. Moritz, the first to draw attention to this graffito, suggested a reading which includes the word bakin, and commented that the kaf was marked with 1 stroke below. Apparently this reading has not been accepted by other scholars, and in fact the photograph and tracing of the inscription, which Yauzin and Sauvignac published in 1922, do not suggest the word bakin, nor is a stroke visible. Thus we are left with no example from before the 3rd century, except for the early Qurans. The early Qurans being problematic in terms of dating, but we'll put that aside. Moritz illustrates one from the mosque of Sayyidina Hussein in Cairo, dating it to the 1st or 2nd century. So in conclusion, it is far easier to assume that the work was a 16th to 19th century pastiche that was falsely assumed to be archaic. This would occur easily as Westerners didn't have much access to the Dome of the Rock, and Muslims have been traditionally discouraged from asking critical questions. In that environment, it is understandable that a false interpretation of how old the mosaics and inscriptions were could take hold. Thank you for watching.